and I'm very pleased to welcome an old friend of mine. Oh, they're coming on already. They don't want to, they're not showbiz, you see. They don't know that you've got to give a build-up and bring them on. But, yeah, you sit down, Ron. This is Ron, who's going to sit in with us. I've just met Ron now. Ron is an amazing character. He's actually Sir Ron Watson for his political, what he's done politically over the years. But in the early 1960s, before the Beatles went to America, he saw the Beatles over 100 times. And Chaz said to me just now, we're going to have fun on stage now in this 45-minute section, and I said, I'll bring Sir Ron on too, and we'll get some of his memories of the Beatles, because you won't have heard those, and we'll have a good time. Anyway, we now welcome someone that I'm sure you all know. He's at the Beatles convention every year, because he brings people over, and he does a remarkable job for Liverpool, for the Beatles, for pretty well everyone. Great guy, written a lot of books too, Charles Rosenay.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody.
Hey!
It's all my friends.
And how do we say your name with the 3 exclamation marks? How did that come about?
They're silent, but I was in a college, and an art teacher said to the students, the way to get A's and to do a great job is to do something different and stand out. And I wasn't that great of an artist. So I added the exclamation marks to everything I painted. He had to give me an A because he thought it was brilliant, but he said, don't pursue your art career. And it stuck with me, and it's great because it's always a topic of conversation, and people who don't even know me personally, but have seen my name in print, it's, oh, you're Charles Rosenay with the exclamation marks.
Yeah, well, I just mentioned you to Ron now, and immediately he said, oh, the man with 3 exclamation marks.
That's great.
Yeah, great. Well, I see you every year at the convention. I don't think you were here last year, were you?
I wasn't here at the past, well.
Yeah, because of Toby, but apart from that, I've seen you, and you bring people over all the time. Do you bring mostly the same people over, or does it change a lot?
Well, this year was about 50-50. Half the people had either been with us 1 or more times, and a lot of people, it's now what they call the bucket list. They've always wanted to come over, and finally they're retired, or they have enough funds, or it's, Charles, you finally talked me into it, and then they're always so grateful. Next year will be our 40th anniversary. So it's very exciting. 40 years of bringing fans from the US and Canada over. Now, many come on their own now, because it's very easy to do that, but we give them a very, very special experience, because we go to London first, stop in Henley, and then we spend the week in Liverpool.
Yeah, and Beatles conventions back then were very different, weren't they? And one of the reasons is, of course, that so many of the people were still alive then who'd seen the Beatles.
And I tell the folks on the tour who go now, you know, we come to the convention, and on one side is Alan Williams doing a little drinking, Bob Wooler would be analyzing what's going on, Sam Leach would be selling a new book, Harry Gray, you know, Ringo's stepdad, and it was just Charlie Lennon. It was just unbelievable. Every corner you looked was somebody who had to do with the Beatles' history.
Yeah, yeah.
And as great as the conventions are now, and as wonderful as everything, sightseeing and all that, is still, we get nostalgic for the people who we've lost through the years.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I was at the very first Beatles convention in Liverpool that Alan Williams organised. And he had this publicity for it, and he said, at this Beatles convention, there is going to be a Beatle. And we all went along to this, and we thought, who's going to be here? Could George Harrison possibly be at this? Could McCartney be at this? And we pretty well decided it was going to be Pete Best. Anyway, we got along there, and Alan Williams then said, and now we come to the star attraction of the evening. We are going to meet a live Beatle. Here he is, Tommy Moore. And the place went silent because people didn't know the back history and everything then, and everyone was going, who the hell is that?
Wow. See, nowadays when it's Chaz Newby or if it was a Tommy Moore, it would be, wow, this is great.
Exactly.
I want your autograph. because those were such an important part of the Beatles' history that wasn't known as well as we know the fans now. Everybody knows the histories. There's so many great books, Janet's books, and so many amazing, and yours. How many books did you do?
Oh, quite a few. I repeat the catalogue. That's it. And you do too. But yes, I mean, I've built up my interviews over the years, and they never go away. I've got quite a bank of interviews, and it means actually that in the books that I do, people are actually quoted accurately.
Right.
And there are people that I've met that nobody else seems to have met, like even more obscure than Tommy Moore is Norman Chapman.
Right.
And he used to work in an art shop opposite the Jacaranda, actually. So, being in Liverpool is great because you meet these people.
Sure.
And Lord Woodbine, of course, who was, did you meet him?
Never met Lord.
Oh, he used to ride around Liverpool late on his cycle, on his bicycle. And he stopped me about 10 years ago and he said, Spencer, he said, you've made £1 million out of the Beatles and I want some of it. And I said, Woody, if I've made £1 million out of the Beatles, you could gladly have some of it.
Two stories
Yeah,
that makes me think of. One was yesterday at the unveiling of the Brian Epstein statue. Was anyone at that?
Oh, yes.
Phenomenal, beautiful. And a gal comes up to me and hugs me, and I'm like, oh my God, I remember her face. Who is this? And she goes, my dad loved you so much. And I said, where did you go to school? And she goes, King David. I go, Alan Williams' daughter. And it was,
Yes.
I had to make that connection without. And the other stories you mentioned about Lord Woodbine asking you for some money. First time I ever met Paul was in Birmingham. It was at the NEC concert he did in '89. And Sam Leach introduced me. And he had his daughter Samantha, and the three of us are there. And it's a longer story, but the end goes, Sam tells McCartney, tells Paul, this is my friend Charles from the US. But he talked like my friend Charles from the US. He couldn't really understand Sam very well.
Yeah.
And Paul goes, oh, nice. He goes, yeah, he publishes a magazine called Good Day Sunshine, which I did then. And Paul McCartney goes, oh, good title, that. And then he says, yeah, and Charles produces conventions in the States. And Paul McCartney said, okay, interesting. And he also brings the American fans over for the Liverpool convention. Paul goes, when do I get my royalties? It was the same thing, but I think Lord Woodbine was serious, and Paul McCartney was kidding.
Yes, indeed. And I thought yesterday, the one thing that people have missed with this statue of Brian Epstein going up in Liverpool is I think this is the first statue, there may be one in America, but I doubt it, to a rock manager. And that is very unusual.
I'm sure there isn't. There's no Colonel Parker statue.
Exactly, because most of these people who were managers were rogues.
Yeah.
And Brian Epstein wasn't. I mean, if you look at early 60s, you have Larry Parnes, who had Billy Fury from Liverpool, and he treated his artists really as workhorses. I mean, he saw them, if they were off on Christmas Day, that was the day when they weren't getting paid.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, then you had someone like Tito Burns, who Cliff Richard sacked because he was doing deals behind his back. And you had Don Arden, who just told the Small Faces parents that he did give them a decent amount of money, but was spending it all on drugs. And and in America you have people like Morris Levy who were thugs, and they based the guy in The Sopranos on him. So Brian Epstein was the first really honest manager.
Well, he's the first international. I mean, there were managers who were friends of the band. Billy J. Kramer's manager before.
Oh, poor old Ted Nibs. Yes.
Ted Nibs was a sweetheart.
Yes.
And he took care of them. So there were managers who took care, but those were in the family or local friends. But on the bigger level, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Brian was above and beyond the greatest.
Yeah, and also he was a great record shop owner. What I loved when I went into Nettles to buy records, because I'm OLD, is when I went in there, say in 1960, 61, if you asked it, I used to collect the American originals, and if you said to Brian Epstein in Nems, can I have top rank JAR 527, he would say, the Shirelles, sir. And he would get them. He knew the numbers of those records.
Amazing.
And it was great.
Did you shop at Nems?
Yeah, a bit closer, Ron. Did you shop at Nems too?
Yes, pretty frequently, and I think like you said, really, it was always the other way around. You would hear the Beatles perform a number and say, where'd that come from? And they would tell you, and you would then go and buy the original. Make an interesting programme, actually, to make the comparisons. So, you know, George Harrison records Roll Over Beethoven, which he took from Chuck Berry, which is the best of the two. Well, the Chuck Berry one is. But there are others where they really did put a unique style to it and made it quite different. Nems was quite an institution in its own right. You know, there's the story. I mean, I can remember actually quite distinctly being in the cabin at lunchtime on the day that Epstein went down for the first day. And he stood out because he was a tall guy. He was quite a bit older, of course, than everybody else. I think he was with Alistair Campbell.
Not Alistair Campbell, no, Alistair Taylor.
Alistair Taylor.
Yeah, and you know, he had this look on his face. He said, "What's going on here?" He was. You could tell. He was almost mesmerised by it. And people say, "Well, he stood out because he was smart." Well, of course, you know, in those days at lunchtime, most of the people at the Capitol lunchtime sessions worked in the offices. So we had suits on. So in that sense, they played to two different audiences. Because I would stay after work and then go to the session in the evening. Audience was different. You know, there were people that worked in the factories, etc. So they actually brought the various components.
Do you think seeing the Beatles 100 times as you did, that they were at their best in the cabin?
I did a pretty dangerous thing when I was a kid. I kept a 5-year diary.
Oh.
You know, where you get 5 lines a day for 5 years. Dangerous thing to do when you're a teenager. The first time I went down, a friend took me. There's an entry. This guy took me down to see this group called the Beatles. I didn't think they were much good.
Wow.
Which is probably one of the reasons why I've never been that successful. I couldn't see it. But I think it's best explained by a point I was making before. I was over in the States some years ago, and a radio program went across Michigan, Ohio, into Ontario, Canada, and a lady rang and said, well, you know, I saw the Beatles at Chase Stadium in New York, 1965. And I said, no, you didn't. Unless you saw them at the Star Club in Hamburg, or the Cabin in Liverpool, or the Kingsway Club in Southport, you never saw them. 61, 62, early 63. After that, they were a completely different, and I'll use the word, product. So I think teenagers of my age were, you know, really, in a sense, privileged. There can't have been that many people across the whole of Merseyside who actually saw them. Maybe 2,000-3,000 people. The audiences were similar. You know, I'd go at lunchtime, I'd go at night. But I'm just that one person.
Now, you said that you heard the Beatles doing a song and you thought, I must have the original of that, and went and bought it. Did you go to the Beatles and say to them, who's singing that song? Who did the original?
Yes. The person who was most cooperative with that was George Harrison. You know, he's regarded as the serious Beatle, but he was. You know, you could spend the short break at lunchtime, you could tell he was practicing and or whatever. I heard one particular number which I think John Lennon recorded actually. It's called Baby Please Don't Go. Well, actually it's not called that. It's called Well. And it's the B-side of Western movies by the Olympics. If you play the original, the Beatles version is just so different, and I would say better, that shows why they had something that was there. So yes, you know, in that sense, George in particular would spend the time. Not the others. I mean, all the caricatures you read about Paul, like the elevation, you know, John Lennon, you could say, told you what to do with yourself. Pete Best sat at the back and thundered out the drums. You've read all this, you probably know it, but it's pretty accurate.
Yeah. And when did you first get involved with the Beatles? When did you first hear of them?
I was this little chubby kid living in the Bronx in New York, and I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and for years I've said that was my first memory in life, was seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And it's really funny because when I started to write the book, I realized that I had a memory before that of my mom in a movie, but we can get to that in a little while, a horror movie, believe it or not. But I wanted to just, before we left Brian, I wanted to say that I thought the statue was brilliantly placed. walking away from Nems and walking to Matthew Street, because it has on so many levels that works.
Yes.
I mean, leaving that past and then the future, walking from Nems to the cavern as he would have, it really was perfectly placed.
Yes, and there's talk of footsteps that are going to go from the statue to the cavern.
Oh.
And it's been said that there are 292 of them.
Oh, that's
which would be the same number that they played at the cavern, which is very good if it's true.
That would be great.
Yeah. But did you think when you were at the cavern, Ron, that the Beatles were the best group around?
I mean, they certainly became the best.
Excuse me.
In the earlier times, my personal favourite was the Big Three. They had a tremendous sound, and there were many others. We were talking before about King Size Talent, the Dominoes, Jerry the Pacemakers were extremely good. But the stories about the Beatles going to Hamburg, I mean, it was Lennon's comment, wasn't it? I was born in Liverpool, but I grew up in Hamburg. And it's pretty true. And when they came back for the first time they'd been there, they were sensational. You know, if you play 7-8 hours a night longer, for a long time, you become very, very good. And they were. You know, what they could do with it, could wipe everybody else off the stage. Didn't go down too well with some of the other bands, but they certainly got to the stage where nobody was really arguing that they were tremendous. But they also knew it. So in one sense, partly that's when the changes started, you know, a little bit. But they wanted success. So their authenticity, if that's the right word, was sanitized out by Brian Epstein. But he made them what they were. Yeah. You know, that's just a simple historical fact, I think.
And you could take another group that Brian Epstein managed, the Big Three, who he couldn't sanitize, who refused to play the game. Yeah. And of course, they sort of self-exploded really a few months later. But I mean, everybody in Liverpool says the Big Three were one of the greatest bands, weren't they, at the time? But it just couldn't happen because they didn't play the game.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And there's a CDM, perhaps an album, where somebody's found the complete listing of recording session they did when they did, was it Peanut Butter or something? That was typical set list of what the Vertigo groups were playing. It's a tragedy that it's not survived, because that would have been Merseybeat at its sort of epitome, in my opinion. Yeah. I still retain the hope that somebody will find one somewhere.
Yeah. And when you did your magazine, Good Day Sunshine, what did you think you were bringing to the party then that was different?
That's a great question. There had been a magazine in the States which was a very popular fanzine, we call them fanzines, called Strawberry Fields Forever, published by Joe Pope. A great American Beatle fan from the Boston area, who also produced the very first Beatle conventions in the U.S. And people forget that. And Joe Pope published a magazine which was very funny. It was great Beatle news and great articles, but with quips, with humor, very Liverpudlian humor, you know, very, very cool inside jokes. And it had stopped. And there was another Beatle magazine called Beatle Fan, which was very, very like the New York Times. Just news, news, news. So I wanted to be something in between those. I wanted to put out a great Beatles magazine that had my personality, which would have humor, which would also give great news, but great articles. And at its zenith, I mean, thousands. It was in every bookstore. It was in Liverpool and all over the world. And we were the most read Beatles magazine, aside from the Beatles Monthly in its day. Yeah. And then, you know, after almost 20 years, I felt that every other month, by putting out a magazine, I was publishing a book. If it was 80 pages or 100 pages, it took its toll, and the internet sort of became something that actually existed, this worldwide, whatever it's called. And Good Day Sunshine, I felt, okay, it's not as needed as it was. And it the conventions continued, and they evolved into festivals. Obviously, my tours to Liverpool continued, but Good Day Sunshine, it was put to an end, and I'm very proud of it, because it had you contributed to many of the issues, as did Bill Harry, And I was very proud of that magazine.
Have you thought of doing a book like The Best of Good Day Sunshine?
No, see, so what this, again, I felt that no more would I ever publish anything. I thought my book days were over because every other month, this was a book to me. I was putting it out and it was so laborious. The intense labor of putting it out was just so consuming and exhaustive. And I said, all right, that's it. I'm never going to put a book out again until the pandemic hit.
Yes.
And pandemic hits, I'm not producing Beatle festivals in the States. I'm not bringing fans over to Liverpool. My other businesses, I was doing Dracula tours to Transylvania because that's my other love, is the horror stuff. Wasn't doing that. And my main vocation, if you can tell I'm a little outgoing, I'm a party DJ. So on weekends I'm doing weddings and bar mitzvahs and school dances and functions. Nothing. I'm not doing anything. I'm taking hikes with the kids. We're watching movies. But my creative juices are flowing. So when they were going to sleep at midnight, I was going on the treadmill, and what could I do? What could I do? And I realized that some years later, I had been in touch with a lot of celebrities, mostly rock stars, and I had asked them their favorite horror lists, and some of them their favorite Beatle lists. Sort of prophetically, I thought, well, maybe I'll do something with that someday. When I went online and I checked my computer, I had about 60 or 70 of these lists from celebrities, including Pete Best, including Tony Bramwell, Gary Von Syak from Elephant's Memory, people who are no longer with us. There was a gentleman by the name of Clay Cole. He was an American DJ, and he's forgotten. He's the only presenter who had the Beatles and the Stones on the same show. The Stones were live, and the Beatles were by videotape when they were doing the promo films. And Clay Cole was. So I said, I have got all these great lists. I'd forgotten how much work it was to do Good Day Sunshine. So during the pandemic, I put together a book. And I said I wouldn't finish the book till I hit 100 of these celebrities. So I added about 20 more. And then 20, 30 more. When we hit the 100, I started shopping it around to the publishers. I probably should have called you because you could have given me some help. But we got a company called Bear Manor Media to publish it. And I'm thinking, wait a second. My first book, people have always said, Charles, when are you going to write your Beatles book? When are you going to compile all the Good Day Sunshine issues to a best of? When are you going to write your memoirs of bringing fans to England and all that? And I always said, no, I'm never going to do that. And sure enough, my first book became a celebrity, pop culture, horror book. Which I would never in a million years have thought that was going to happen.
So this is a book of the top 10 horror lists that's come out.
It is. I brought a copy to show off. And
I love the fact that in the introduction to this book, Charles gives himself a 5-star review.
Absolutely. If I'm not going to do it, who else? No, I know you're teasing, but the introduction to it is basically my bio and how I always thought that Ed Sullivan was my first really memory in life. And there's pictures of me. Thank God my parents took a lot of pictures in a Beatles wig, holding my grandma's mandolin lefty. And I was, before we knew what lip syncing was, we didn't call it that, I was miming the Beatles the following week on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I have pictures of that. And in the book, it's just amazing. I don't think we can show everybody, but I'm going to show you. There's a picture of me.
Well, and we got it on the screen. You can probably see
Oh,
that.
you can see it on the screen?
Yeah.
So there's a picture of me in my pajamas in my bedroom. There's a Beatles poster on my wall, and all the monster toy models that I made. And it's literally, that was my, aside from baseball, that was my life as a kid, the Beatles and this monster stuff. But for the 40 years that I've been coming to Liverpool and doing the Beatle conventions, everything else, nobody knew that, the dark side of Charles Rosenay. They didn't know that I was into this horror stuff.
And there wasn't such an interest in the 60s and then in the 50s in Liverpool in the horror stuff. Simply because horror comics were banned in this country. And the American horror comics, we just couldn't get them at all.
It's true. It was not just that, but even the horror movies had to go through a much more difficult censor board to be released. And some of the movies that were what the equivalent of R in the States, which means kids could see them with their parents, were rated X or whatever the adult is here.
Yeah.
And so it was much more limited.
Yeah. I mean, I saw fairly recently a film from 1956, which I went to see at the time when I was underage, called The Amazing Colossal Man.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a guy who's 70 foot tall. Everybody was affected by atomic radiation in those days. And the guy who's looking after him, the soldier who's looking after him, said he's gone. So this 70-foot man is gone. And they go out into the mountains to try and find him, and they found one footprint they couldn't afford anymore. And so, obviously, The Amazing Colossal Man is hopping. You know, it really was they really were shocking films.
They were grade B, maybe grade Z,
Yeah.
independent, low-budget films, but so charming.
Yeah.
And so what's great is if you're a fan of these movies, or even if you're not, let's say the only horror movie you know is Psycho.
Yeah.
Or The Exorcist, you can look up the index in the back and see which of the stars like the same movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I gotta share with everybody one chapter, and I'm probably beating you to a question.
Okay.
If I may.
Okay.
I asked Julia Baird, everyone knows who Julia is, right? John Lennon's sister. I said, Julia, I need a favor. And she's always great. If I need a video, whatever, she's been a guest at my conventions in the States. I said, I'm writing a book. Will you do a chapter? And when I told her the title, she said, Charles, I hate horror movies. I don't think I've ever seen one, but leave it with me. And she took her time, and I get back an email with this phenomenal chapter on the elements of horror in literature.
Yeah.
So her top 10 list is Shakespeare, it's all the great horror elements in literature. And for someone who wasn't going to do a chapter in the book, who I wanted, because I wanted a bunch of Beatle, for my Beatle people, I wanted Beatle chapters, top 10 list. She gave me such a great list. That's the largest chapter in the book.
Yeah.
It's like a college, university thesis. It's so brilliant.
It is. It's a marvellous chapter.
Yeah.
And you haven't got the great horror writer from Liverpool, have you? Ramsey
Clive
Campbell.
Barker.
Oh, Clive Barker, and he's a Wirral, isn't he, actually, I think.
Yeah.
But Clive Barker and Ramsey Campbell.
Ramsey Campbell. No, and I should have. But the sequel to this, and I'm giving away another one of your questions. So this is what? The book of top 10 horror lists from celebrities, rock stars. The sequel is the book of top 10 Beatle lists. And I'm getting celebrities and rock stars to give me their... So it'll be more interesting if I could get the horror writers to give me Beatle lists.
Ah, yes.
So we're about 50 or 60 lists into it.
And have you found any horror sites in Liverpool?
There are. There's something called, is it Chillerpool?
Oh yeah, the tourism.
They do the tours
Yes,
and all
yeah.
that.
But there is not far from here, only about 200 yards from here, in Rodney Street, Mackenzie's grave. You know that, don't you, Ron? And Mackenzie was someone who in about 1890 was playing cards and he was losing and he thought he was playing with the devil. And the devil said, I'll let you have one more hand and I'll play for your soul. But otherwise you can win everything back. And he lost.
Great story.
And the devil apparently said to him, I'll come back for your soul. So Mackenzie thought, I can't be buried under the ground. And so he had a word with this church, and the grave is there, and he was buried sitting like this at a card table holding a winning hand, and they built a pyramid around it.
Brilliant.
And that's in Liverpool.
So when I finished this book, lists were still coming in.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, all right, maybe someday I'll do the bride of the book of top 10 horror lists and do a sequel. But I got a great list from Bill Harry of horror sites and interesting sites throughout Liverpool and London. So he did. I bet that is in there. I bet that story is in there.
Probably is, yeah. I mean, Bill has got a great interest in horror films too.
Yeah.
And let's get back to the Beatles anyway. And Ron, you mentioned you've seen the Beatles a lot with Pete Best. You saw them with Ringo Starr. What do you remember about the changeover?
Massively controversial. I was on holiday actually, and I came back, and that was the big news. You know, I went down and there was Ringo on the drums versus Pete Best. It really was hugely controversial. Caused an awful lot of ill feeling.
Yeah.
So he still does up to a degree.
So you weren't expecting it at all?
No, nobody was. You know, there's all the comments that were made. They didn't like the fact that Pete Best was probably the most popular with the girls, as he was. There were some pretty cruel things that were said at the time. The audience will forgive me, but what of them was, why have the Beatles swapped an indifferent but remarkably good-looking drummer for an ugly, indifferent drummer? That's pretty cruel, and it's not true. But the wonderful thing about it, of hindsight, Ringo fitted in. You have to remember that he was the most professional of them all. You know, he had his own drum kit with his logo. He had a stage name. He had a stage spot with Roy's Northern Hurricanes. They used to play every Sunday afternoon in Southport. He was a professional guy, and you know, he knew what to do. My opinion of him has gone up dramatically, actually, as each year has gone by. I think his drumming on certain tracks, that say Come Together, is extremely good. But at the time, nobody could really understand why this had happened. And the truth, I mean, you did a very interesting book, Spencer, dropped out. Nobody can get to the, nobody has yet given the definitive, truthful story, in my opinion. So I think all of the component parts that were mentioned, they will all have a grain of truth in them. But the overriding reason, I still can't tell you that I know what that was.
Pete always says that he was never told why he was sacked from the Beatles. But he also says, Brian Epstein said to me, they don't want you in the Beatles anymore, you're not good enough. So it's just that he was told, but he didn't accept it.
If you haven't heard, our friend Dave Bedford has a great video on YouTube right now where he's gone really deep into it, and he has a new theory.
Yes.
I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you have to watch his YouTube video or chat with him here, and it's very interesting about Pete Best not necessarily having been sacked, but being convinced that he was, so that he moved on.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave that mystery, but you already know the story. But it's worth checking out. If it's not already in one of his books or a future book, it's in the YouTube video that David Bedford did. Definitely check it out.
And what do you think of the records that they made with Pete Best?
Oh, they're great. I mean, it's like a Dave Clark atomic drumming. You know, there's the fills aren't the same as Ringo's, but I don't think Ringo was doing that in those days either. You know, Ringo developed new styles and really rose as he went. He created great drumming things. I don't know if Pete would have. I think he would have, you know, because out of necessity, if you're with these three amazing creative people, you know, you have to rise to the occasion. I'm an old guy who plays basketball with young guys, right? And I play my best and try to compete because I know they're better than me. And I'm not saying that they're better than Ringo or better than Pete, but when you're in that kind of a class where you have to rise to the occasion, you do, or you drop out, or you just stop. And I don't think either of those, Ringo or Pete, were the personalities who would have stopped. So who knows? You can only speculate as to where Pete would have gone.
Bob Muller told me once that in 1962, early in 1962, he remembers an occasion at the Cavern after a lunchtime session, before the evening session, where the Beatles were rehearsing, and he said, Paul McCartney was saying to Pete Best, this is what you've got to do on the drums, and he took over the drums and was playing what was wanted. And Bob said, at the time I thought, this is a bit rich, you shouldn't be telling the drummer what to do.
Wow.
But of course, it fits in line with McCartney's character. He probably could play the drums better than Pete Best.
Well, he would tell Ringo what to do also.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, but it's indicative, you know, that they weren't too happy about things.
Right.
Yeah. Bob was one of the great characters on Merseyside. We miss him a lot, I think. And you must have heard him introduce the Beatles. Was that a magical moment?
Yes, the time for Bob Muller, we were talking about the big three before, and because that famous EP live at the camp, that was the session where all the other tracks were discarded. So, but I think it's about the only recorded piece with Bob Woolron making the introductions.
Yeah.
He played a lot of significant part in their development. He really did push them. Wasn't treated very well by Lennon. There's that famous incident, as we all know. I suppose what I'm getting at is that all of that went along up to a point, and they probably reached their peak in terms of the sort of band they were. And then Epstein took over, and they went from that to a worldwide, international phenomenon. So the difference is huge. And on that basis, who played the part in that? Would Pete Best have been able to adjust, as it were, to that? Probably not. I think on Merseyside, and people who recall it and felt sorry for him, when they brought out the anthology series, the 3 sets, I think Pete Best was offered a deal which was, you can either have so much money up front, or you can have a share of the profit. He took the share of the profit. I understand it worked out at a very, very significant sum.
Good.
So, at the end of the day, people like me will think, well, okay, perhaps in the end, there was a bit of justice there.
Yeah, the first Beatles anthology sold 13 million copies, and I always remember, because the Quarrymen are on that too, and I always remember bumping into Colin Hanson, the drummer, in the street at the time, and at the time the Quarrymen hadn't reformed, I don't think, and he was an upholsterer actually working on seats for buses. I think he did 20,000 Merseyside bus seats. Anyway, I remember bumping into him, and he said, I've just been offered a contract by Apple because I'm playing on the anthology, and he said, they've offered me £2,000.
Oh.
Do you think I should take it?
Oh.
And I said, I don't think so. And I haven't liked to ask him since, did you take it or not? But I sincerely hope he didn't. Because if you only get a penny a track and it sells 13 million, that's a heck of a lot of money.
What surprised me about Pete, who gave me, Pete Best gave us a list, is he puts in Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman, which is, that generation, you would understand. But he did also The Omen and Amityville Horror, Blair Witch Project, so that surprised me that he was also into current scary movies.
But what is interesting too, the difference between American and British pop at the time, is you've got a lot of American pop records that are about horror, like Dinner with Dracula and the like.
Yes.
And they didn't mean anything really to the British over here. They weren't hits or anything, because we didn't see these horror comics.
Oh, that's so funny. What really shocked me is our friend Tony Bramwell. He did a list for this, but he had a connection with a famous horror actress. And I guess his auntie was Elsa Lanchester, who was the bride in Bride of Frankenstein. I wouldn't have known that had he not done a list and put that in his information.
And then you've got Barry Maguire in there. And he has his top 10 horror list, and he puts Barack Obama in there. And I'm thinking, this man's nuts.
It's a little weird, yeah.
Yes.
But I gave them their...
you didn't edit the list.
Well, I edited the grammar, and I made them sound better than they would have. But I didn't censor the lists. And they were open to do not just horror movies. The lead singer of the B-52s did it. Some did the scariest soundtrack songs. Some did the scariest nude scenes in horror. Another one did, the lead guitarist from Vanilla Fudge did the funniest horror movies, Abbott and Costello and Young Frankenstein. So I gave them their carte blanche to write what they wanted, as we know with Julia. And it gives for a better book.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about the Beatles is that when Brian Epstein takes them over in November '61, and you can confirm this, Ron, it seems to me that Brian Epstein's first job, he thought, was, I'll make them big in Southport, which is about 20 miles away from here. All of a sudden, they're playing one Southport gig after another.
Yes, I mean, I think what he wanted to do was sort of break out, as it were, of the Merseyside syndrome, and going 20 miles to Southport was thought of as being quite a big deal. I actually went to the show where Joe Brown was the headliner, and they were second, and all the other bands were on, the Big Three was on, Jerry and the Pacemakers. That was probably the first show where a lot of these bands had ever broken out of a fairly limited geographical area. So it's an important gig, that one. Joe Brown remembers it well, as I'm sure you probably know, Spencer. But, you know, from then onwards, they just went from one to the other, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then, of course, the breakthrough. There's no way around it. The breakthrough is the States. Nobody'd ever done that before. And there's lots of reasons why. I think Charles probably know better than me, but, you know, at that time, America was looking for something. They wanted to be cheered up. It had Kennedy, you know, and suddenly, as one of the reporters said at the time, who are these four little skinny guys from Liverpool? That's the way they were described, wasn't it? But they were different. But of course, to me, they weren't the band I knew, which is not to say I can't appreciate. I mean, I get this difficult question often: what's your favourite Beatle album? I can't answer it because I have two. One is the first one, Please Please Me, because that was an element of the stage show that I saw time and time and time again. But in terms of innovation, I've always preferred Revolver above Sgt. Pepper, for example. You would have never thought in those days that they would produce something like Revolver, Sgt. Pepper. You just wouldn't. So there's a difference. I'm going to use the word product. It's a completely different product. But those of us who saw them, and I say there are not that many people really, actually been quite privileged about that, because you know the story all the way through. And Lennon made the point, didn't he? There were at some reception with the mayor at the town hall, and there's crowds and crowds and crowds outside, stretching for miles. And Lennon's comment was, well, where were you all when we were playing, at the Capital lunchtime sessions, and it was 5 pence to get in?
Yeah.
It's a fair point.
But you were kind by saying some of the reporters said those 4 skinny, tall kids. It was mostly those 4 shaggy guys from England with the ridiculous hair is more of what they were saying.
Oh yeah, it was very, well I mean, they said at the time that the Rolling Stones were a bunch of scruffs, didn't they? And yet you look at them now and they look perfectly normal. And what was long hair then isn't long hair now, certainly. Yeah. And Ron, you saw the Beatles, you told me you saw the Beatles at the Palace Hotel in Southport, which surprises me because this isn't in any of the Beatle books.
I'm absolutely sure I did. My girlfriend, we've now been together for 61 years or something.
You should marry
her.
Well, I never had any hesitation that I should, and that's what I did. I've never had any doubts about her. I think she still probably hasn't quite made her mind up yet. But, we're sticking with it. But she lived just down the road from there. And I am absolutely convinced on Saturday night, one of the reasons I remember it was like what you used to call a mixed bill. So there's a traditional jazz band, and then the Beatles. Local paper ran a piece, I think, didn't they, some years ago, and 4 other people wrote in and said, we remember that, but there's no evidence ever being produced. And unfortunately, the hotel has gone with it all of the records, of course. But, it's one of these things, somebody somewhere might have something that will shed its light. But I'm quite convinced that it did. And the reason I remember it was because it was unusual. It wasn't one of the venues I would normally go to.
Yeah. One of the shows, I only saw the Beatles a couple of times, but I saw them on the Roy Orbison tour at the Liverpool Empire, and I can't remember who actually closed the bill on that show. But I talked to one of Roy Orbison's band about 10 or 15 years ago, and he told me something very interesting, that Roy Orbison, when Roy Orbison came on, everyone was just shouting for the Beatles. And Roy Orbison said to the band as he came on, pianissimo. So he told them to be as quiet as possible. And he just went, a candy-coloured clown, they call the sun, and tiptoes to my room every night. And then he brought the volume up. And by taking the volume right down, the people stopped screaming to listen to what was happening. And I thought that was a great example of stagecraft. And it is, isn't it?
Unless he got it wrong. Because they could have kept screaming and
yes.
And that worked out. That was brilliant.
Yeah. And what was your favourite time of seeing the Beatles? Your favourite show, if you could go back in time?
They did a regular Monday night gig at the Kingsway Club in Southport, January, February, March '62. So I think by that time they were, fully developed in that sense. Still, quite friendly, casual. I remember helping Pete Best carry his drums up the stairs and things like that. On the Orbison thing, the tour, I think, I'm right in saying, Spencer, started off with him closing the bill, and halfway through they changed it. We've still got the programme somewhere, actually.
Yes.
But again, you see, that's the sort of thing that happened was, people like me, I went to see Roy Orbison, I didn't go to see the Beatles. Why would you pay, think of the figures, 2 and 6pence for 25 minutes of screaming when you couldn't hear anything?
Yes.
When you were used to paying 5p for 2.5 hours with no interruptions. Why would you do that? Well, because we did. Last time I saw it would be early '63, but after that, why would you do that? Well, millions did. But if you'd seen the night, for that sort of price and for that length of time.
And if you could go back in time, Chaz, and see the Beatles just once, what gig would you pick?
I would want to see them at the Star Club or the Kaiser Keller. I'd want to see a Hamburg show for sure, because it would be the longest of the shows, and probably the craziest and the loosest, and my gosh, if there was ever footage from that, how valuable that would be.
Yeah. And I'd like to see them with Tony Sheridan too. That would have been interesting.
Right.
I mean, they learned so much from him, didn't they?
Yeah.
And Jerry, the way Jerry holds his guitar, that's straight Sheridan, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Great. Anyway, it's been great to have you on today. And Chaz's book is called The Book of Top 10 Horror Lists, and you're signing them at the back of the hall.
I'm actually going back to my stall, which is in the main room, and I'll do it there.
Right, so Chaz has got his books there at the main stall. Have you got other books as well there?
Yes.
Yeah, and so do you want to say what they are?
So I have a newer book out, but no one's going to want it. It's the ghost stories of Connecticut. But when we come next year, hopefully the book of top 10 Beatle list will be ready. But I'd love to sign this for everybody who comes to visit me at the table. And even if you don't buy a book, come visit at the table.
Okay, and so thanks very much to F Rosenay and also to Sir Ron Watson.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. One more minute. Nice round of applause for Spencer Lay. He's been doing these interviews and is such an integral part of Beatleweek. Been here forever. Thank you. Thank you, Spencer.